Good evening and welcome back to Rest Through History. Here is the paradox to fall asleep on. Around the year 1100, on a floodplain across the river from where St. Louis now stands, there was a city larger than London, larger than Paris, a city with a plaza the size of dozens of football fields, a skyline of earthen pyramids, and a population that would not be matched again on this continent for 700 years. And then, sometime in the 1200s, it began to empty. By the time any European set down a written word about the place, it had been silent for generations. So silent that when settlers finally asked who built it, there was no one left who could answer. And the name we use tonight, Cahokia, was borrowed from a different people entirely, a group that had only recently moved into the ruins. What could make a city vanish so completely that it lost even its own name? This is not a story about a vanished tribe, because nobody vanished. It is not a story about primitive villages waiting to be discovered, because there was nothing primitive about a society that could level 50 acres of floodplain by hand and raise the largest earthwork north of Mexico on the far side of it. It is a story about a metropolis, its rise, its machinery, its center, and its quiet unbuilding, told the way the evidence actually allows, with the gaps left standing where they belong. If a story like this is the kind of company you want at night, consider subscribing. Only if it earns it. There is no obligation and no hard feeling either way. Before we start, tell me where in the world you are tonight and what time it is where you are lying. I like knowing that this same city, the same low mounds and the same wide river, is settling over a listener in Seoul at breakfast and a listener in Lisbon just after midnight. At the very same moment, in the same telling, let the room go a little darker now. If you have a fan or something that hums, let it hum. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You do not need to remember any of this. You only need to be here for as much of it as you're here for. We begin on a stretch of ground the Mississippi has been rearranging for 10,000 years, in the centuries before anyone had reason to call it anything at all. Cahokia Creek moves slowly through that ground even now, a modest stream you could wade across in most seasons, and for 300 years before anyone built a mound beside it, it was simply one more waterway among dozens threading a floodplain the river had been remaking since the last ice age let go of the continent. The region has a name today, the American Bottom, a stretch of alluvial land running some 80 miles along the river's eastern bank between modern Alton and a point south near the Kaskaskia, and at its widest it spreads nearly 11 miles from the bluffs to the water. It sits almost exactly where three rivers meet, the Missouri arriving from the northwest, the Illinois from the north, the Mississippi carrying all of it south. Anywhere three rivers meet, silt collects, and here it had been collecting for millennia, laid down flood after flood into soil dark and loose enough to work with a wooden hoe. That fertility is the whole reason anything that follows was possible. It is worth sitting with the ordinary version of this place before the extraordinary one arrives, because the extraordinary one grew directly out of it, and nobody living here in, say, the year 800 had any reason to expect what their grandchildren's grandchildren would build. People archaeologists call Late Woodland lived across this floodplain in small scattered communities, farmsteads and hamlets more than towns, most of them set on the low rises and terraces where the ground stayed dry when the river rose. They had good reason for caution. Before roughly 600, the Mississippi in this stretch flooded often and hard, and the record shows settlement pulled back toward higher, safer ground during those centuries, away from the rich but treacherous lowest ground closest to the channel. Then, for reasons still argued over in the hydrological literature, the big floods largely stopped. From around 600 to 1200, this bend of the river went unusually quiet, and people came down off the terraces and moved out onto the floodplain ridges themselves, the low swells of ground separated by old sloughs and meander scars where the soil was richest of all. A 400-year lull in a river's temper does not announce itself as a historical turning point. It simply makes certain choices survivable that would not have been survivable before, and populations tend to drift, generation by generation, toward whatever has quietly become survivable. What they were eating before corn mattered here at all was largely their own. Long before anyone in the American Bottom had heard of maize in any serious way, farmers across the mid-continent had already been tending a suite of native plants for 1,000 years or more. Goosefoot, maygrass, marsh elder, little barley, sunflower, a starchy, small-seeded garden that produced real yields without the labor of clearing forest for a crop that hadn't yet adapted to the local growing season. This assemblage has a name now, the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and it is easy to underrate because none of its plants survive as staples on anyone's table today. But it is the reason the floodplain was already partly cleared, already partly domesticated, centuries before the crop most people associate with this whole culture had any real presence in it. Maize itself had travelled a long road to get here, bred first far to the south in landscapes with a much longer growing season, and for a long time it simply did not perform well this far north. It took generations of selection, plant by plant, season by season, by people whose names none of us will ever know, before a strain existed that could reliably ripen before an Illinois autumn ended it. Only then did maize stop being a minor garden crop and start becoming something a family could actually live on. Pottery from these centuries carries its own quiet record of change, the kind archaeologists read the way a geologist reads rock layers. Earlier late woodland vessels tend towards simple chord-marked surfaces and a narrow set of shapes made and used within a single small community. As the centuries wore on toward the year 1000, new tempering materials, new rim styles and new decorative techniques begin appearing across sites that had not previously shared them, evidence, however faint, of communities that were beginning to talk to each other more, trade with each other more, perhaps intermarry more than their grandparents had. None of it looks dramatic in a museum case. It looks instead like the plain material trace of a region slowly knitting itself together before anyone had a reason to build a plaza. There is a household worth pausing on here, not a named one, because no one from this period left a name behind, but a documented kind of household, reconstructed from the post holes and storage pits and hearths that a late woodland homestead leaves in the ground. A family like this lived in a small rectangular house built of upright wooden posts and thatch, set near a low ridge above a slough, close enough to the water to fish and trap and gather, close enough to open ground to grow their goosefoot and their squash, and increasingly as the centuries wore on, their maize. Storage pits dug into the earth beside the house held the surplus that got a family through winter and through the lean early spring, when stores dwindled before the first plants came up. Their tools were stone and bone and wood. Their pottery was plain and functional, made for cooking and storage rather than display. Nothing about their material world announced that they were living through the early chapters of what would become, in less than 3 centuries, the largest city north of Mexico. They were living, as most people in most eras are, through what felt like an ordinary life on ordinary ground, adjusting each year to weather, to harvest, to a river that had for once mostly stopped trying to kill them. Mounds were not new to this part of the world when this story begins, and it is worth saying so plainly because the instinct is to imagine Cahokia inventing the idea from nothing. It did not. More than 2,000 years before the American bottom filled up, people at a place called Poverty Point, far south along the Mississippi, had already raised earthworks on a scale that still surprises visitors today. Centuries later, the people archaeologists group under the name Hopewell had built elaborate geometric earthworks and burial mounds across the Ohio Valley, an interregional exchange network stretching from the Rockies to the Gulf, moving copper and mica and obsidian and shark teeth across a continent with no wheels and no draft animals. By the time the late woodland households of the American bottom were quietly farming their floodplain ridges, that Hopewellian world had already faded, its great earthworks already old, already something the living generation had only heard about rather than built. Mound building, in other words, was not a new idea waiting to be discovered here. It was an old and half-forgotten one, waiting for a population with the surplus, the organization, and the reason to take it up again, on a scale no one before them had attempted. What was accumulating through all of this was not spectacular, it was arithmetic. A little more reliable maize each generation, a little less flood risk, a few more storage pits, a few more households on a few more ridges, a slightly denser scatter of hamlets along a slightly wider stretch of the floodplain. Estimates for the whole American bottom in these centuries before the surge run modest by any later standard, likely somewhere in the low thousands, spread across dozens of small settlements. Nothing that would have struck a traveller as more than an unusually well-populated stretch of river country. None of it looked, from the inside, like the beginning of anything in particular. That is usually how the beginning of something enormous actually looks, from the inside to the people living it, like an ordinary Tuesday repeated for 200 years. By the last decades of the 10th century, the population of the American bottom had begun to climb in a way that later archaeologists would be able to measure, but that no one living through it could have named, because there was no word yet for what they were becoming, and the low mound at the center of one particular stretch of creekside floodplain a place with no name that has survived, had not yet been raised even one basket of earth high. A 50-acre plaza does not level itself. That is the plain, physical fact that sits underneath everything else in this next stretch of the story, and it is worth holding on to before any of the more dramatic explanations arrive, because the explanations are still argued over and the fact is not. Sometime around the year 1050, the people living along Cahokia Creek took a landscape of low ridges and shallow swales, the same uneven floodplain ground their grandparents had farmed, and filled it, flattened it, and turned it into open, level public space roughly the size of 40 American football fields laid side by side. They did this, as far as the excavated evidence shows, in a short span of time, not across generations. Houses that had stood for years were dismantled. Older, smaller mounds were buried or built over. An entire neighborhood's worth of ordinary domestic life was cleared away to make room for a civic center that had not existed the generation before. Archaeologists have a name for this moment now, borrowed, half-jokingly, from cosmology, the Big Bang. The name fits better than it should. In the span of what may have been as little as a single generation, a modest Late Woodland settlement of a few hundred people became, by most estimates, a planned city housing something on the order of 10,000 residents at its ceremonial core, with tens of thousands more spread through the farming communities around it. New forms of pottery appeared with no obvious local ancestor. New styles of stone tool, new house construction, an entirely new civic layout organized around cardinal directions, and a central axis running through the largest mound appeared at the same moment, as if imposed all at once rather than accumulated slowly. Old villages nearby, places people had lived in for generations, were largely emptied out, their populations drawn into the new center. This is not how culture usually changes. Usually it drifts, argues with itself, absorbs outside influence in fits and starts over centuries. Cahokia's transformation reads, in the archaeological record, more like a decision than a drift, and that is precisely what makes it strange. So the honest question, the one that has occupied 2 generations of archaeologists, is what could produce a decision of that size, made by people who left no writing behind to explain it. Several answers exist, and none of them commands unanimous support, and that dispute is itself part of the story rather than an obstacle to it. One line of thought associated most closely with the archaeologist Timothy Pocketat treats the transformation as the deliberate work of a charismatic leader or a small coalition of leaders, a religious or political vision compelling enough to pull thousands of people out of their scattered farmsteads and into a single engineered, sacred landscape within a few years. Pocketat has also pointed to something that happened in the sky. In the summer of 1054, a star in the constellation we now call Taurus exploded, visible by day for weeks and by night for the better part of 2 years, bright enough that it was recorded independently by astronomers in China and the Arab world. What remains of it is the object modern astronomy calls the Crab Nebula. There is no way to know, and Pocketat is careful to say so, whether the people building the Grand Plaza connected their new city to that light in the sky. What is also true is that the timing sits close enough that the coincidence is difficult to dismiss and impossible to prove, which is exactly the kind of thing a listener falling asleep to this story is allowed to simply sit with unresolved. A second, less romantic and equally well-supported explanation looks at the weather instead of the stars. Tree ring records reconstructed for this stretch of the Mississippi Valley show that the decades around 1050 were among the wettest 50-year periods of the entire past 1,000 years in this region, a run of reliable rainfall landing on top of increasingly productive maize and centuries of accumulated floodplain fertility. A population that has just been handed several consecutive decades of agricultural surplus is a population with the labor, the food security, and arguably the confidence to attempt something as audacious as leveling 50 acres and raising the largest earthwork north of Mexico on the far side of it. The climate explanation and the visionary leader explanation are not actually in competition. A prophet needs followers who are not worried about starving before they can afford to spend a season moving earth in baskets instead of tending their own fields, and 1050 may simply have been the first moment in generations when that was true for enough people at once. Whoever or whatever set it in motion, the city did not build itself out of people who were already there. Isotope studies on human remains from Cahokia's burials, chemical signatures locked into tooth enamel that record the water a person drank as a child, show that a meaningful share of the population buried at Cahokia did not grow up along the American bottom at all. Some of the people who lived and died in this city as adults had spent their childhoods drinking water from rivers and springs a considerable distance away, in watersheds with a different chemical signature entirely. We cannot give any of them names. We can only say, from the mineral record locked into their own teeth, that a woman buried near the city centre may have spent her first years of life somewhere else, and chose or was brought or was born to parents who had already made that same journey to end her life here instead. Cahokia, in other words, was not simply a place that grew. It was a place that pulled. Not everyone came to live inside the new city itself. Roughly 40 miles up the Mississippi from the American bottom, at a bluff-top site archaeologists now call Trempolo, excavators have found a small settlement built apparently at or just before 1050 with construction techniques, pottery and religious paraphernalia identical to Cahokia's own, planted in the middle of what had been someone else's territory. It looks, to the people who dug it, less like an accident of trade contact and more like a shrine, a Cahokian outpost carrying the new religious order outward before the mother city had even finished leveling its own plaza. Closer to home, on a low ridge with an unobstructed view of the eastern horizon, another site called the Emerald Acropolis appears to have been laid out with its main axis pointed toward the point on the horizon, where the moon rises at its northernmost extreme, an alignment that only repeats once every 18.5 years. Some researchers now read Emerald less as an observatory and more as something to a place of pilgrimage, a shrine drawing worshippers in from the surrounding countryside for gatherings tied to that rare lunar cycle rather than a site anyone actually lived in year-round. Whoever designed that axis understood something about the sky that took patient, multi-generational observation to learn, and they built it into wood and earth architecture with enough precision that it still points where they meant it to 900 years later. By the time this initial surge had run its course, Greater Cahokia, meaning the central precinct together with two neighboring precincts that grew up on either side of the river, the East St. Louis complex and a smaller cluster where downtown St. Louis now stands, covered something close to 6 square miles and held roughly 200 earthen mounds arranged around open plazas, with thousands of pole and thatch houses laid out in planned neighborhoods. None of this required writing. None of it required the wheel, or draft animals or metal tools harder than copper. It required people willing to carry earth in woven baskets load after load for as long as it took, and enough shared belief in whatever this new order promised them that tens of thousands of individual decisions to leave a familiar village and join a new city could all point the same direction at once. By the time the wet decades gave way to a longer, more ordinary run of Mississippi Valley weather, the 50-acre plaza stood open and level in front of a mound that was still, in those years, being built taller. Whatever had been decided in that short span around the middle of the 11th century had already stopped being a decision and had become simply the shape of things. The next generation would not remember Cahokia any other way. Every basket of earth that became Monk's Mound had to be carried by hand. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is closer to the literal truth of how the mound reached its final volume of roughly 25 million cubic feet, dug from borrow pits scattered around the city, some of which are still visible today as shallow ponds, loaded into a woven container a person could carry on a hip or a back, walked up an earthen ramp, and dumped, one load at a time for generations. Multiply that single act by the number of loads required to raise a structure 100 feet high, with a base wider than the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza, and you begin to understand that Cahokia's central monument was not really an architectural object at all. It was a record of labor compounded across decades by people whose names the earth does not preserve but whose effort it does. The city organized itself around that monument the way a wheel organizes itself around a hub. From the summit of the mound, standing on what was likely a large timber building serving as residence or temple for the city's highest-ranking family, a person could look south across the Grand Plaza towards smaller mound and plaza clusters, repeating the same pattern in miniature, each apparently serving a neighborhood or a lineage group rather than the city as a whole. Ordinary houses, by contrast, were modest, rectangular structures built using a wall trench technique, in which builders dug a narrow continuous trench, set upright posts into it at close intervals, then wove smaller branches between them and packed the whole wall with clay and thatch. A method faster and more standardized than the older habit of setting individual posts one hole at a time. Houses like this clustered in small groups of 3 or 4 around a shared open courtyard, several families to a group, The whole arrangement repeated block after block across a landscape that, from above, would have shown the kind of deliberate street and neighborhood order a modern city planner would recognize immediately. Some courtyard groups appear from the debris left behind to have specialized. One cluster dense with the waste of stone tool production, another with the broken cast-offs of pottery making, a pattern of craft neighborhoods that would not look out of place described in a medieval European guild town, except that no one here had a guild charter or a written contract, only custom and proximity, and whatever arrangement kept the arrangement working. To the west of the central mound, on a low rise, stood the structure that gives this section of the story its clearest anchor. Archaeologists call it Woodhenge, a series of circles of upright red cedar posts rebuilt larger and with more posts at least 5 times over roughly 2 centuries, the best documented version consisting of 48 massive timbers set in a ring some 410 feet across, with a single observation post near the center. Stand at that center post on the morning of an equinox, and the sun rises directly over a specific post on the eastern arc of the circle. Stand there at the summer solstice, and it rises over a different one, the northernmost. At the winter solstice, the southernmost. None of this required mathematics in the sense we would recognize it, or metal instruments. It required decades, probably generations, of patient, repeated observation, passed down by people who understood that the discipline of watching the same horizon at the same moment year after year would eventually produce a reliable calendar, one built entirely from cedar and shadow and memory that could tell the city's farmers exactly when to plant and exactly when the harvest window was closing. The food that calendar helped schedule came from fields that, by the city's peak, stretched well beyond what the eye could take in from any single mound top. Maize by this point was doing the caloric work an entire metropolis leaned on, supplemented still by the older native crops, by fish taken from the oxbow lakes and backwater slusses that laced the floodplain, by deer and waterfowl from the surrounding bottomland forest, feeding 10 to 20,000 people at the ceremonial core, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding farming communities that supplied it, was itself a logistical achievement most listeners never think to credit a society without wheels, without draft animals, and without a written system of accounts. Surplus grain had to be grown, harvested, dried, stored in pits and above-ground granaries, and then moved into the city on someone's back or in someone's canoe, on a schedule tight enough that a poor harvest anywhere nearby could be felt within a season by everyone downstream of it in the social order. Consider for a moment one household of shell workers, again not a named family but a documented kind of household, reconstructed from the debris their work left behind, heaps of broken and unfinished marine shell, drills, worked bone tools, discarded fragments by the thousands, found concentrated in specific neighborhoods rather than scattered evenly across the city. Marine shell does not occur naturally 1,000 miles from any ocean. It arrived at Cahokia already having traveled from the Gulf Coast, likely hand-to-hand along river routes and overland trails, exchanged at each stage for something else the next community wanted, until it reached workshops here where it was cut, drilled, and polished into beads, pendants, and ornaments by people whose entire working life seems to have revolved around that single craft. Some individual pits excavated near these workshops have yielded tens of thousands of finished and unfinished disc beads in a single deposit, evidence of production on a scale that argues for organized, sustained labor rather than a hobby practice between other chores. Those finished beads then moved back outward into burials, into gifts, into the pouches of travelers heading toward the Great Lakes for copper, or the Appalachians for mica, or the upper Mississippi for the fine, luminous quartz called Mill Creek Chert, from which Cahokian workshops produced the hoe blades that broke ground in maize fields hundreds of miles from where the stone was quarried. A city this size did not simply sit at the center of a trade network. It ran on one, the way a modern city runs on shipping lanes and freight rail, except every mile of it moved on a human back or down a river current. Public life had its own rhythm, distinct from the daily grind of farming and craft work, and its own equipment. Archaeologists find, scattered across Cahokia and at Mississippian sites for hundreds of miles in every direction, smooth disc-shaped stones a few inches across, worn and polished from use, evidence of a game called Chunky, a stone disc rolled across a cleared, hacked earth court while players hurled long wooden poles, trying to land their pole nearest the spot where the disc would eventually stop. It sounds, described flatly like that, like a pastime. The evidence suggests it was closer to a civic institution, played publicly, wagered on heavily enough that European observers who encountered later versions of the game recorded onlookers betting away tools, clothing, even their own liberty on the outcome, and spreading, alongside Cahokian pottery styles and religious iconography, to Mississippian communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. A stone disc a person could hold in one hand traveled, in the centuries after Cahokia's rise, farther than almost any other single object this culture produced, which is its own kind of testimony to how much cultural gravity this one city exerted on everything around it. There is a dry fact worth sitting with here, without much comment. For a population this size, organized this tightly around agriculture, astronomy, and craft, Cahokia in these decades was very likely a larger city than any other place on the North American continent would be again until sometime after the year 1800. It required no bishop, no senate, no coinage, and left behind, as far as anyone has found, no writing at all, and yet by the plainest measure available, the number of people who woke up each morning inside it outstripped every English or French town of its own century, and every American city that would exist for the next 700 years. 20,000 logs is a specific enough number to sit with for a moment. That is the estimate for how much timber went into the palisade wall Cahokians raised around the city's ceremonial core sometime near the middle of the 12th century. Whole tree trunks, cut, stripped, dragged from forests that were, by this point, a meaningful distance away, and set upright in a continuous trench stretching nearly 2 miles, enclosing Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and the neighborhoods immediately around them behind a wall taller than a person could see over. They rebuilt it at least 4 times, the last rebuilding stretching from roughly 1175 to 1275. Each rebuilding meant another 20,000 logs, another round of felling and hauling and digging, a recurring public project on a scale that only a society with real command over labor could sustain more than once, let alone 4 times over roughly a century. What the wall was actually for is one of the questions Cahokia has never answered for us, and the honest thing to do is say so rather than pick the more dramatic reading and call it settled. It could have been defensive, a response to rising tension either within Greater Cahokia or with communities beyond it, and there is a scatter of skeletal evidence across the wider Mississippian world in these centuries, healed and unhealed trauma, that shows violence was not absent from this landscape. It could equally have been about controlling who was allowed to see what, and when, a boundary less about keeping enemies out than about keeping the most sacred ground legible only to those with the standing to cross into it, bastioned watchtowers along its length doing as much work as ceremonial threshold as military lookout. Both readings are argued seriously in the literature. What is not in dispute is what a wall like that requires of the people who build it. The ability to conscript labor at a scale beyond any single household's choosing, and enough shared acceptance of that authority that thousands of people spent months of their lives cutting and hauling timber for a boundary most of them would never live inside. That kind of authority leaves its clearest trace not in walls but in graves, and the clearest single grave at Cahokia sits in a modest ridgetop mound south of the main plaza, a place archaeologists number without much ceremony Mound 72. Beneath it, excavators in the late 1960s found a platform holding 2 adults laid out together, their bodies resting on a bed of thousands of small marine shell disc beads, arranged deliberately in the recognizable shape of a bird in flight, the wings extending beneath the arms of the dead, the head and beak beneath their heads. For decades this was described as the grave of 2 men, a ruler and an attendant, and the image took on a name of its own, the Birdman, tied to a warrior falcon figure that recurs across Mississippian art from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. More recent skeletal reanalysis using techniques unavailable to the original excavators has revised that reading. What the bones actually show, most researchers now conclude, is a man and a woman buried together, not 2 men, and the falcon platform beneath them may carry meaning closer to the ceremonial architecture of the cosmos, the layered underworld the shell itself was thought to belong to, than to any single warrior at all. Both versions have been believed sincerely by serious people working from the same ground. This is simply what it looks like when a discipline corrects itself in public, decades after the fact, on a detail this central to how an entire society's power once looked at rest. Whoever the 2 people beneath that platform actually were, the objects surrounding them tell a story that needs no correction. caches of finely worked arrowheads, hundreds of them, made in styles and stone traceable to sources in Wisconsin, in Tennessee, in southern Illinois, and in the Caddoan communities of what is now Oklahoma, gathered from an area spanning close to 1,000 miles, and laid beside these two bodies, as though the whole reach of that world had been called in to attend a single funeral. Sheets of hammered copper, likely once wrapped around the handles of chunky sticks, sheet mica cut into shapes. This was not the burial of two farmers. It was the burial of people whose deaths mattered enough to enough of Cahokia's world that objects from 1,000 miles away were assembled to go into the ground with them. It is worth pausing here too on a question that sits underneath every sentence in this section: whether Cahokia was actually ruled the way this narration keeps implying, by rulers, by an elite, by something recognizable as a court. Most archaeologists who have spent careers on this site think the evidence for real hierarchy is strong, pointing to exactly the disparities this section has described: the beaded burial against the ordinary house, the walled center against the open countryside. A smaller number of researchers and a wider popular argument made in recent years by writers outside archaeology proper have pushed back, suggesting that Mississippian society, and Cahokia's in particular, may have combined real inequality in specific ceremonial and religious contexts with forms of collective decision-making that a simple picture of kings and subjects does not capture, closer to what some call heterarchy than hierarchy, power distributed and contested across several institutions rather than concentrated permanently in one family line. Neither side of that argument denies what Mound 72 contains. They disagree about what kind of society could produce it, and that disagreement remains genuinely open. The same current that pulled objects toward Cahokia was by this point in the city's life also carrying Cahokia's own image outward, sometimes carried by actual Cahokians who packed up and moved. Roughly 500 miles north, in what is now southern Wisconsin, a late woodland community at a site called Astalan shows an abrupt architectural shift right around the year 1100. Platform mounds appearing where none had stood before, a massive palisaded town wall going up around 15 acres of settlement, pottery and stone tools and chunky stones indistinguishable from the ones being made at Cahokia itself. The most straightforward reading is that Cahokians themselves arrived there and rebuilt the place along the lines of home, exporting not just goods but the whole civic template, plazas and mounds and a walled perimeter, to a landscape 500 miles from the American bottom. Archaeologists studying this pattern across dozens of sites, from Trempilo in the north to communities hundreds of miles southeast, have started calling the broader phenomenon Cahokianization, a word that only exists because the influence itself was real enough to need a name. A shared visual language, falcon warriors, severed hands, weeping eyes worked into shell gorgets and copper plates and painted pottery, an artistic tradition later scholars would group together as the southeastern ceremonial complex, spread across a huge stretch of the eastern half of the continent in these same generations, radiating outward from workshops here in ways that make Cahokia look, for a century or more, less like a city among other cities and more like the source code for an entire religious and artistic world. None of this expansion required conquest in any sense a European chronicler would have recognized as war. It required something closer to gravity, a center dense enough, wealthy enough, and confident enough in its own vision of the cosmos that other communities hundreds of miles distant chose to remake themselves in its image, sending their dead north in arrowhead caches, sending their own people to build a smaller Cahokia beside a lake in Wisconsin, sending back copper and mica and marine shell that kept the whole current running both directions at once. By the time the palisade had been rebuilt for the third or fourth time, the city behind it was no longer simply the largest settlement north of Mexico. It was the center of gravity for an entire religious universe stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. And like anything built on that scale, on gravity rather than treaty or garrison, it would only hold together for as long as people kept choosing, generation after generation, to believe in it. The rain simply stopped mattering the way it used to. Tree ring records pulled from the wider region around the American bottom, cross-checked against each other the way climate scientists now do for any period before written weather records existed, show three distinct stretches of droughts severe enough to register across the whole mid-continent in the centuries Cahokia occupied this floodplain. One lasting from around 990 to 1060, a second from roughly 1135 to 1170, and a third, later and worse, from 1276 to 1297. It is the middle one that matters most for this part of the story. Around 1150, in the later years of what tree rings suggest was a 15-year run of drought, the uplands east of the city, where farmers had spread out to grow maize on ground safely above the floodplain's flood risk, began to fail. Archaeologists call that upland farming zone the Richland Complex. Dozens of small agricultural settlements founded not long after the city's initial surge, feeding surplus grain down into Cahokia's core the way any capital depends on a productive countryside it does not itself till. By the time this drought had run its worst years, most of Richland had been abandoned. Not burned, not conquered, simply left. Fields untended, storage pits empty and finally uncovered. A supply line the city had leaned on for a century quietly went dark, household by household, at the exact moment the wider region was also running short on rain. Consider one household there, again undocumented by name but documented by pattern. A family that had spent 2 or 3 generations on a farmstead in those uplands, watching a maize crop they depended on shrink season after season, watching neighbouring homesteads empty out first, weighing at some point that no single harvest made obvious whether to stay on ground that kept disappointing them or walk back down toward the city and whatever the city could still offer. Multiply that quiet, private calculation by however many hundreds of households made some version of the same decision across those years, and you get what the record actually shows. Not a single catastrophe, but an accumulation of ordinary people, individually and separately, concluding that the arrangement was no longer worth it. It is worth pausing here on what the palisade wall looked like in this light. Its most extensive rebuilding, the one stretching across roughly a full century, went up around Cahokia's ceremonial heart at very close to the same years this drought was emptying the farmland that fed it. That timing does not prove the wall was defensive. It does mean that whatever else the wall was doing, ceremonial boundary, cosmological threshold, it was also being built by a society under real measurable stress, cutting and hauling 20,000 logs at a moment when the fields fewer than a day's walk away were failing. Skeletal remains recovered from Mississippian sites across this broader region and period, not only at Cahokia itself, show a rise in exactly the kind of trauma, healed fractures, unhealed cranial injuries, that archaeologists read as evidence of interpersonal violence increasing across these same decades. Whether that violence was warfare between communities, raiding tied to scarce resources, or something closer to internal unrest, is not something the bones alone can settle. What they do settle is that this was not a peaceful stretch of Cahokia's history, and yet the plainest measure of collapse, population decline, refuses to behave the way collapse is supposed to. By most current estimates, Cahokia's ceremonial core did lose a significant share of its residents across these same decades, something on the order of a large fraction of its peak population gone by the century's end. But at almost the same time, the rural countryside immediately around the city appears to have grown, not shrunk, with some estimates putting that surrounding population's increase at over half again what it had been a generation before. People were not simply fleeing Cahokia. Meaningful numbers of them appear to have been leaving the crowded, walled, increasingly stressed center for the farmland just outside it, trading proximity to the mounds for room to grow their own food on their own terms. This is not a portrait of a city dying, it is a portrait of a city redistributing itself under pressure, and the two readings, decline and redistribution, do not cancel each other out. Both are true at once, and neither one, on its own, tells you what will happen next. What can be said plainly is this. For the first time since the 50 acres in front of Monk's Mound were levelled a century earlier, Cahokia had been tested by something it had not chosen and could not simply outbuild. It had weathered droughts before in a smaller, hungrier form, back when it was still a scatter of late woodland hamlets with far less to lose. This time it had 100 years of accumulated scale to lose, a walled centre, a religious gravity pulling in objects and people from 1,000 miles away, an entire cosmological order built into the alignment of its mounds and its wooden circles. It survived the 1150 drought, the wall stood, the mounds kept their shape, the Woodhenge posts kept marking the same horizon they always had, but something had shifted that would not shift back. A city that had spent its first century pulling people inward, toward the plaza, toward the mound, toward the center of its own gravity, had just spent a decade and a half watching some of those same people calculate, quietly, in their own kitchens and fields, that the center was no longer the safest place to be. Say the plain thing first, because softening it would be its own kind of dishonesty. In the same ridgetop mound that holds Cahokia's most elaborate burial, the platform of shell beads and the two people laid out upon it, archaeologists also found several mass graves containing, by the most cited count, more than 50 young women, most of them between the ages of 12 and 25, laid out in careful rows, layer upon layer, over what appears to have been more than one occasion across the mound's use. Their bones show almost no visible trauma, no cut marks, no broken bones consistent with a violent struggle. The physical anthropologists who have studied them since believe, without being able to prove it from the bone alone, that these young women died by strangulation or by bloodletting, methods that leave little trace on a skeleton, and that they were killed deliberately and in numbers as part of the ceremonial life surrounding this mound. Elsewhere in the same complex of pits, a separate group of 39 men and women shows the opposite pattern entirely: broken bones, embedded projectile points, at least one case of decapitation, bodies dumped rather than arranged, two different kinds of death in the same small hill, within roughly the same span of decades. This happened. It is not in serious dispute that it happened, and no amount of admiration for Cahokia's astronomy or its trade networks should be allowed to quietly edit it out of the story. What is genuinely in dispute, and has shifted more than once within living memory of the archaeologists who study it, is who these young women were to the people who killed them. For decades after Mound 72's excavation in the late 1960s, the working assumption was that they came from outside Cahokia entirely, captives or a form of tribute extracted from subordinate communities, offered up to accompany the deaths of the city's rulers the way conquered populations were sometimes forced to supply sacrificial victims in other early states around the world. It was, in a sense, the more comfortable reading because it let the violence sit at Cahokia's edges, something done to outsiders rather than something the city organized against its own. Then, starting in the 2010s, teams working with strontium isotope signatures locked into tooth enamel, the same method used earlier in this story to trace where Cahokia's immigrants had grown up, went back to the remains in Mound 72 and asked the question properly. The isotope ratios in most of the young women's teeth matched the local geology of the American bottom itself. So did the shape and structure of their teeth, features that run in family lines and shift slowly, generation to generation across a population. The people being sacrificed, in other words, were not captives brought in from some distant subordinate territory. For the most part, they appear to have grown up eating the same food, drinking the same water as everyone else buried at Cahokia. They were local. Some of them may well have been closely related to each other and to the very community organizing the ritual that killed them. This is simply true, and it does not require qualification. Young women from Cahokia's own community were killed, in numbers, as part of the ceremonial apparatus surrounding the burial of the city's elite. What is also true is that one of the groups in that same mound, a set of burials researchers label F229 lower, shows a different dental signature from the others, distinct enough that its members may represent a smaller, separate population within or near Cahokia, rather than a random cross-section of the city, which means the picture even the corrected evidence gives us is not perfectly uniform. Perhaps different mass graves on different occasions drew from different sources. Perhaps the local finding is right in general and wrong in this one particular. The scholars who did this work say so themselves in print, without embarrassment. The new evidence raised at least as many questions as it answered. There is no framework available to a modern listener, humane and otherwise, that makes this comfortable to sit with, and it should not be made comfortable. It also should not be flattened into a single sentence of judgment, because a single sentence cannot hold what the evidence actually shows. A society capable of tracking the solar year to the day, of moving copper 1,000 miles by hand, of pulling immigrants toward it from watersheds hundreds of miles distant, organized on more than one occasion the ritual killing of its own young women, at an age when most of them should have had decades of ordinary life still ahead of them, and buried the men who died alongside them by violence rather than ritual in the same small hill, as if even in death the record needed to keep those two kinds of loss separate. Some archaeologists who have spent years with these particular bones have said, plainly, that the site feels to them less like a settled explanation than an open wound in the historical record. A place where everything else Cahokia accomplished has to sit beside something that resists being made into an achievement. That is not a professional failure. It is what honest contact with this kind of evidence looks like. What can be said, honestly, is that we do not know what any of the women who died there believed about their own death as it was happening, whether it was understood by their community as honor, obligation, punishment, or something with no comfortable English word at all, and the nature of the surviving evidence means we likely never will. Their families, whoever they were, left no account. Their own voices do not survive in any form the ground has preserved. What survives is the shape their bodies were left in, careful, deliberate rows, and the shape a stranger's grief has to be content with, standing 900 years later on a low grassy mound outside modern Collinsville, Illinois, knowing only that this happened more than once, to people who had grown up drinking the same water as everyone else who mourned them. No one burned Cahokia down. That fact matters more than it sounds like it should, because it rules out the easiest kind of story, the one with an enemy army at the gates and a single terrible night that ends everything. There is no layer of ash across the site, no mass grave of war dead dating to the city's final decades, no European chronicler's account of a battle because no European arrived in time to see any of this happen at all. What the archaeological record shows instead is slower, harder to narrate, and in its own way more unsettling. A population that kept shrinking decade after decade for roughly a century and a half until the plazas were simply empty. The numbers, where they can be estimated at all, tell a story of steady contraction rather than sudden rupture. By the close of the 12th century, the ceremonial core had already lost perhaps half the residents it once held at its peak. Across the century that followed, most estimates put the population somewhere in the low thousands, a fraction of what the 50-acre plaza had been built to hold. The palisade wall kept going up and coming down through these same decades, evidence that whatever tension had first justified its construction a century earlier had not resolved itself. It had simply become a permanent feature of civic life, the way a modern city might normalize a security apparatus it once considered temporary. For a long time, the leading explanation for why this happened involved the forest. In the early 1990s, researchers proposed what became known as the deforestation hypothesis. A city this size, building and rebuilding palisades, mounds, and thousands of houses, cutting timber for fuel and for the great cedar posts of Woodhenge, would have stripped the surrounding woodland faster than it could regrow. And a deforested floodplain erodes faster, floods harder, and produces smaller harvests exactly when a growing population could least afford them. The theory found wide acceptance for a generation. It made intuitive sense, and it fit a pattern archaeologists had seen collapse other societies elsewhere in the world. More recent fieldwork has complicated it, and the complication deserves to be told rather than quietly dropped. A study published in 2021, led by the archaeologist Caitlin Rankin, examined soil layers near one of Cahokia's mounds, specifically looking for the erosion signature deforestation should have left behind. What she found was soil that remained stable for centuries after the city was already emptying, only beginning to show serious erosion in the 1800s, under 19th century farming, hundreds of years after the last Mississippian residents had gone. This does not prove Cahokians never cut down trees. It does mean the tidy story of a city that ate its own forest and starved on the stumps is not, at this one site at least, what the ground actually shows, and researchers who once championed the deforestation theory have said publicly that they welcome the correction rather than resent it. That is what an honest field looks like from the inside. Theories built carefully, tested against new evidence, and revised in public when the evidence disagrees. What the ground does support, more consistently across multiple independent lines of evidence, is water, in both of its failure modes. A significant flood event left its mark in the sediment record close to the year 1200, right around the point the population begins its steepest documented decline, and oxygen isotope records pulled from a nearby lake show conditions turning persistently drier from 1200 through the 1300s, part of a broader shift some researchers connect to the onset of what would later be called the Little Ice Age, a last severe drought running roughly from 1276 to 1297, arrived on top of a food system already stretched thin by a shrinking aging labour force and farmland the Richland uplands could no longer fully replace. Flood, then drought again, layered across a century that also saw walls rise and fall 4 separate times. None of this reads as one cause. It reads as several genuine pressures arriving in the same place in overlapping decades, on a system that had been built for a wetter, calmer world than the one it was actually going to have to survive. There is also, underneath the environmental story, a harder question some historians have started asking more directly in the last several years: whether people simply stopped wanting to live the way Cahokia asked them to live. A few writers, working outside archaeology proper, have argued that the decades of consolidation, sacrifice, and walled control described in earlier parts of this story may have produced something closer to exhaustion with the whole arrangement. And that departure from Cahokia was not only a response to drought and flood, but, for at least some households, a choice against the kind of authority the city had come to represent. This reading is contested, and it should be, because it is harder to prove from artifacts than a flood layer is. What is not contested is that in the centuries after Cahokia emptied, the wider Mississippian world it had once dominated moved, broadly, away from single overwhelming centers and towards smaller, more numerous polities, several of which show real evidence of shared, distributed leadership rather than a single paramount authority. Whether that shift was a direct rejection of Cahokia's memory, or simply what happens after any large center collapses, is not something the evidence currently settles either way. There is no dramatic final scene to offer here, and manufacturing one would betray everything this story has tried to be. What the evidence supports is smaller and, in its way, harder to sit with. Household by household, generation by generation, people who had spent their whole lives within sight of Monk's Mound made the same kind of quiet calculation the rich land farmers had made a century earlier, except now there was no thriving center left to walk back toward. They walked elsewhere instead, taking with them a religious vocabulary, a style of pottery, a way of playing chunky, that would surface for generations afterward in Mississippian communities the city had once helped to shape. By around 1350, the mounds stood mostly empty of the people who had built them, the Grand Plaza going quiet enough that grass and scrub could begin, slowly, to reclaim ground that had been swept and packed hard by foot traffic for 3 centuries. One archaeologist who has spent a career on this question put it about as honestly as the evidence allows. It was a slow demise, and we do not fully know why people were leaving. That sentence is not a failure of scholarship. It is what the record actually supports, and pretending otherwise, for the sake of a tidier ending, would be its own kind of lie. Nobody who watched Cahokia's plazas go quiet in the 1300s left behind a written account of it, because nobody there wrote, and the next people to leave a written record of this ground did not arrive for more than 300 years. That does not mean the ground itself went empty. Excavations and archival research published in recent years have pieced together evidence of a Native American presence in and around the old city that continued for centuries after its ceremonial life had ended. Small communities living among the mounds well into the 1500s, using this ground the way people use any fertile, well-watered stretch of river country, long after the last basket of earth had been carried up Monk's Mound. Cahokia did not become a ghost town the moment its last resident left. It simply stopped being the largest city on the continent and became, slowly, something quieter. When French missionaries and traders did finally establish a permanent presence nearby, founding a mission in 1735 on one of the mound's own terraces to serve a small local Illiniwek community, the great earthworks were already old to them, already unexplained, standing over a floodplain resettled by people who had no ancestral memory of who had built them. One of those communities was a group of the Illiniwek Confederacy that French sources came to call the Cahokia. They were not descendants of the mound builders in any sense the archaeological record supports. They had simply moved into the area generations after the city was gone, and when European settlers eventually asked who had raised these earthworks, this newer community's name was the one that stuck permanently to a city and a culture that had called itself something else entirely, something no one now living has any way of recovering. The land itself did not fare much better than the memory of it. Of roughly 120 mounds once standing across the Cahokia complex, only around 70 survived today. The rest were leveled for farmland, quarried for fill dirt, or simply ploughed flat by generations of settlers who had no reason to suspect they were farming on top of a city. Across the river in what is now downtown St. Louis, an entire second precinct of Cahokia's urban sprawl, dense enough with mounds that early American visitors nicknamed the young city Mound City, was almost completely erased by 19th century urban development. Only a single significant mound survives there now, an island of earth in a landscape of streets and buildings that has otherwise forgotten what it was built on top of. Monk's Mound itself owes its modern name to an accident of a few short years. In 1809, a group of French Trappist monks fleeing the aftermath of their own revolution took up residence on the mound's lower terraces, planting gardens, attempting to found a monastery they called Our Lady of Good Help. Malaria took nearly half of them within a few years. Crop failures and a catastrophic flood weakened what remained, and the New Madrid earthquake of 1812 finished the job. By 1813, the monks were gone, having occupied the largest earthwork in North America for barely 4 years, a fraction of a single lifetime set against the 3 centuries the mound had spent as the living center of a metropolis. And yet it is their name, not the builders, that survives on every map and every sign at the site today. The 20th century treated the site with a mixture of neglect and eventually rescue. Unregulated digging and encroaching development threatened to erase what remained until the state of Illinois purchased the central portion of the site in 1923. Decades later, in the early 1960s, construction crews building the interstate highway system, the same modern road network that today cuts directly through the edges of the old city, triggered salvage excavations ahead of the bulldozers, and it was archaeologists working against that construction deadline who first uncovered the post holes of Woodhenge, a discovery that would very likely not have happened, at least not then, without the highway that was simultaneously threatening to destroy other parts of the same site. The federal government's own infrastructure, built to move 20th century commuters at highway speed, is part of the reason anyone today knows the 11th century built a solar calendar out of cedar. Cahokia Mounds became a National Historic Landmark in 1964, entered the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, and was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, one of only 24 such sites in the entire United States. A designation that places this earthen plaza in the company of the pyramids of Giza and the temples of Angkor. Roughly 250,000 visitors now climb Monk's Mound's modern staircase each year, and every spring and autumn equinox before dawn, people still gather at a rebuilt circle of cedar posts outside Collinsville, Illinois, to watch the sun rise exactly where a Cahokian priest calculated 9 centuries ago that it would picture one more person before we leave this floodplain. Not a ruler, not a name inscribed anywhere, just someone documented by pattern the way most of the people in this story have had to be. A child born around the time the 50-acre plaza was first leveled, who grew up watching Monk's Mound climb another terrace every few years, who was old, if they lived that long, by the time the palisade was rebuilt for the 3rd or 4th time and the fields upriver had gone quiet. One human life, start to finish, inside a story that took 3 centuries to tell. They were wrong in the end that what they had built would hold. No one who leveled that plaza in the 11th century could have known that drought and flood and a slow bleeding away of neighbours would eventually empty it. What they were right about is harder to dismiss, that this stretch of river bottom could support more people, more ambition, more astronomy and art and trade than anyone before them had thought to attempt. Both of those things are true about the same people in the same city, and neither one cancels the other. Here is what is still simply there. Monk's Mound still stands in the middle of Illinois farmland, its base wider than the footprint of the Great Pyramid at Giza, exactly where the ramp to its summit was climbed 900 years ago. 70 of Cahokia's original mounds still rise, low and green, out of the same floodplain grass, including the one lonely survivor across the river in the middle of modern St. Louis, a single earthwork standing among office towers that were raised without a thought for what came before them. Every spring and autumn equinox before sunrise, people still gather at a rebuilt circle of cedar posts and watch the sun come up over the same post it was built to mark. The word Cahokia, belonging to none of the people who actually built the city, is printed today on road signs across 3 Illinois counties, and from the mound's summit on a clear morning the gateway arch still catches the light 7 miles to the west, a silver line over a city that has no memory of the older one it was built beside. There is no lesson to draw a neat bow around here, and this story never promised you one. Just a floodplain that held a city larger than most of the capitals of its own century, for a while, and then did not, and kept the evidence of both anyway. If you are still here, thank you for staying this long. If you are not, if sleep found you somewhere back in the drought, or the beaded burial, or the quiet years after the wall went up, that is exactly how this was supposed to go. Wherever you are tonight, the same river is still moving past the same low mounds it has been moving past for 10,000 years, patient, indifferent, entirely unbothered by what time zone you're lying in. Rest now.